Hello again. Um, Today we are going to be covering the change of president from Putin to Medvedev that I introduced in the last video. Just to recap, in 2008, um, Medvedev is sworn in as the new president of the Russian Federation. This is the result of the so-called castling move. I don't know how many of you play chess, but this is a defensive move when you move the rook um, over and the king over to protect the king. And this is also, you'll see in the literature, called the tandem, because the tandem meaning two operating as one helping to protect the other. Um, Remember also November of 2008 is the November 4th is when Barack Obama was elected president. So you have new presidents going into 2009. Now Russia, again also in 2008, was involved in the war with Georgia over the two dissenting uh, rebellious provinces, North Abkhazia and Ossetia. And Russia survived the world financial crisis better than many countries because of the economic changes that Putin had put in, trying to get more money for the federal government and building up what we call in the West rainy day funds, having quite a bit of money set aside to deal with these crises. So let's begin with 2009, Putin's Medvedev's first full year as president, and in March uh, he proposes a reform of the civil service system. Uh, Medvedev was a lawyer, if you remember. He makes a big thing about not using the phrase dictatorship of law that's been associated with Putin, but he has a more traditional, more Western-oriented view of law. So he's trying to fight corruption by doing civil service reform. That's one of them. However, in May, if you look down on the chart there is the presidential commission that he appoints on innovation um, and the false attempts to falsify history. A presidential commission on false attempts to falsify history. What is this all about? Since the fall of the Soviet Union under Putin, there's been a serious effort at recasting history, trying to put a favorable light on many of the things that happened in the Soviet era and the Tsarist era. Putin seems to want to have the Russian people think of himself as a continuation of solid, strong leadership that has stretches back to the Tsarist era. He's especially they seem to be especially concerned about developments in the independent former Soviet republics like the Baltic and even Ukraine, where certain national historians are writing about the experience of the Soviet era as not very favorable lights. That the Soviets occupied these countries and oppressed the nationals of the various countries. And same thing happening in many other republics. And so this is an effort on the part of the Russian government to try to put out their view of history. All right. Then we move to the next page, and we'll see in June there was a series of proposals to change the election or selection of constitutional court judges. The 93 Constitution had the current Chief Justice being elected by his associate justices. And this is a proposal whereby the President would appoint the Chief Justice, and the term of office of the Chief Justice would extend from 3 to 6 years. Also, I guess I haven't really talked a lot about the crackdown on particular journalists. Now, I did mention last time, I believe, the killing of the very famous Russian human rights advocate and journalist Anna Politkovskaya, and she was one of um, many journalists who are writing stories, investigating stories that uncover the problems associated with the regime. They risk their life. In fact, Russia is one of the most dangerous places for reporters. They're rarely do they find who commits the crime, murder, or brutal assault against some of these reporters. And if they do find somebody who may have been involved, they never find who initiated it. And in July, there was a particularly brutal attack upon a woman in Chechnya who was working for Memorial, this human rights group that tries to keep alive the memory of the people who served who died in the gulags. And Medvedev says that he is outraged by this killing of investigative journalist, and that's a pretty strong statement on the part of the president. All right, now let's look at September. Um, the reports coming out of the press that both Medvedev and Putin are interested in another presidential term, and so people in the West, reporters and scholars are beginning to speculate, is there a little bit of tension between Medvedev and Putin over this? That Medvedev is maybe beginning to enjoy being president, and Putin doesn't like to see his colleague maybe getting more press and more attention on the world stage than Putin, as prime minister. Um, Medvedev also says some things that imply that he is very critical of people who hold power for power's sake, and by implication, that seems to be possibly referring to Putin. In October, there are regional elections held throughout Russia, and United Russia does quite well as expected, but it's expected because there is considerable election rigging, ballot stuffing that goes on, typical of elections in Russia. In December, I note here, Yegor Gaidar dies. He was the first so-called prime minister of Boris Yeltsin. He is the Russian father of economic shock therapy. Remember, this was a Western idea, but Gaidar was one who was helping to guide that. All right. I also make reference here to a new patriarch, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is enthroned, Kirill I. This is important because, if you remember, under Nicholas I, they instituted this phrase, autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism. And then the Soviets were atheist and attempted to wipe out the predominance of the Orthodox Church. But since Putin has come back, all politicians acknowledge the importance of the Orthodox Church and use this as a tool to help shore up their positions. All right, and just in passing, let's make reference to the fact that if you remember the incident of the reset, the fact that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State with the Obama administration, met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in March of 2009, and they talked. She gave him a button that was supposedly sort of like a button. It was an advertising by Target. You press this red button, and they thought that it had said reset on it. Well, they didn't have it, the Russian exactly right. But this was indicative of supposedly the Obama administration was going to try to rebuild the relationship with Russia. All right, so let's move on to 2010. beginning with these widespread demonstrations in Kaliningrad. Now, Kaliningrad, if you look at a map, is this tiny little part of the Russian Federation that is separated um, over by Poland. And the people there in this region felt very underappreciated. They had one of the highest unemployment rates in the Russian Federation, um, and prices have been going up. The cost of public transportation going up, and this brought tens of thousands of people out on the streets, protesting the fact that they thought that they were not getting any recognition by the Russian government. And that's followed up with a series of major demonstrations in Moscow. Again, tens of thousands of people coming out in the so-called Days of Anger. These were people who were demanding electoral reforms, a whole range of demands being put on the government by these demonstrations. A lot of it has to do with the government's efforts to raise the retirement age of men and women from 55 to 63, and men from 60 to 65. Um, so this was an indication that there is a dissent growing in Russia. However, bear in mind this is always in the larger cities, and also in March there were nationwide local elections were held. And again, what party dominates? United Russia, despite these demonstrations. So this gives you should give you some understanding that the opposition to Putin, the demonstration, the opposition to Putin and Medvedev, is a small slice. It tends to be, and we've talked about this before, urban, better educated, younger people protesting, and the old Democrats who were part of the effort to change the Soviet Union. So you get this strange mix of ages here. But United Russia and its apparatus uh, basically um, often doesn't register candidates that might be strong opponents. They restrict um, election monitoring activity, and of course the old traditional way to control an election ballot stuffing goes on. All right, but in the days now of cell phones with cameras, a lot of these incidents get reported and captured on phones, and um, it seems that the regime, despite the fact of overwhelming support for the regime, they're not content with taking a chance. Because if you remember, Putin goes back to the defeat of his mentor, Anatoly Sobchak, in St. Petersburg, and realizes that when you hold free and open elections, anything can happen. Your opponent can be beaten, and he prefers to manage democracy. Remember? Okay. All right. April, again, you see another terrorist attack, this time in the metro, the Moscow metro, and 40 people were killed. Again, this is associated with the Chechen rebels. There's also, the line below that talks about bombing in Dagestan too in March, and then in April, 12 people killed, including a local chief of police. Um, then another bomb in April planted in a police uh, uh, checkpoint in the streets. Dagestan is a part of the Russian Federation. It is a republic in the Russian Federation that adjoins the Chechen Republic. All right, and it is predominantly Muslim, and the Chechens have been in flaming opposition to the central government there as well. So again, this struggle against Chechnya is still lingering, and occasionally then the Chechens rebels remind the Russian public that they're not going away by conducting these bombing attacks. I also have at the bottom of the page the negotiation or the creation of the New START agreement, um, The previous START agreement had expired in December of 2009. This is a major nuclear arms agreement between the United States and Russia. The result of this that both countries cut their nuclear arsenals by about one-third. So it's a pretty substantial agreement on the part of the Obama and the Medvedev governments. In June of 2010, we get another instance of Medvedev trying to assert, I think, his independence because he makes some remarks that are interpreted as being critical of the Putin's government involvement in environmental problems. Now, what's been going on around Moscow that this relates to is that there is an old growth forest, the Kimsky Forest, and they have developed an NGO called the Defenders of the Kimsky Forest, and they are protesting against the government's plans to build a superhighway to help connect Moscow and continue up to St. Petersburg through this old growth forest. And it's generating a lot of controversy, a lot of demonstrations, lots of problems for the Medvedev government. And Medvedev is trying to position himself as a more liberal authoritarian ruler, that he wants to take into account issues of environmental safety, and he tries to put himself as a new type of leader. Also that month, Putin announces this big energy deal between Western companies. And this is, I think, this is Putin trying to steal some limelight away from Medvedev, because typically this is the kind of announcement that the president of the country would make. And we also have in June the so-called Hamburger Summit. I don't know if you remember reading about that. A presidential summit in Washington, D.C. between Medvedev and Putin, and called the Hamburger Summit because apparently after some discussions in the White House, Obama suggested that they go out and get a burger at his his favorite burger joint that was over in, I think, Arlington. I believe the name was Ray's Hellburger. So they went and had a burger. And these two relatively similar ages, Medvedev is at least 10 to 15 years younger than Putin. You should know that. And Putin and Obama really thought that he could build a good, solid relationship with Medvedev. They liked high tech. They liked their cell phones. They played computer games. They seemed to be a new generation of leadership coming to the fore, and they seemed to hit it off pretty well between the two of them. There were some positive things that came out of this, not just the burgers, but this Obama made a serious commitment to push for Russia's entry into the World Trade Organization, something they had been after since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it does follow shortly thereafter the summit. Russia agrees to increase the importation of poultry from the United States, and that's a big deal. So Medvedev's first visit to the White House seems to go off pretty well, and everyone seems to be thinking this is like an era of good feeling. It goes back to a concept from old American diplomatic history. And then in September, Medvedev dismisses the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, who was on that list of oligarchs that I gave you weeks ago under the Yeltsin period. And it seems like Lushkov was getting on the nerves, if you will, of Medvedev. There had been newspaper reports of the corruption associated with Lushkov, but that's not unusual. There was complaints in the city that the mayor had too close ties with builders, and a number of the old historic buildings were being torn down. People were being moved out of their apartments, and then new high rises were going up, and the rates, the rentals or mortgages were astronomically, something that most average Russians couldn't deal with. And the time when there were some serious forest fires in the adjoining area around Moscow in the summer, um, and Lushkov was on vacation in the Crimea and didn't come back. And this is just like Putin in the incident with the Kursk, you know, thinking that, oh, well, it's okay. What am I going to do? Put out the forest fire? So he stays on vacation, and the people of Moscow who are affected by the smoke that's coming into the city from these fires were not too happy with that. And so Medvedev uses his authority as president to remove the mayor of Moscow. And he says he does this because the mayor has lost the trust of the president of the Russian Federation. And then, in an interesting aside comment, Putin says, I hope that I will get to express my opinion regarding the next mayor. Now, all of that seems to imply that Medvedev was doing this off on his own without any coordination with Putin. And then in December, Putin makes a statement that in which he compares Khodorkovsky, the former CEO of the Yukos Oil Company, who's in jail. He compares him with Al Capone, the American gangster. And he blames Khodorkovsky for multiple murders. And there is a second trial, a second trial on, while he's in prison. He's tried a second time for stealing oil, and he's given 7 additional years in prison. And Medvedev makes a comment that no government official should comment on a trial before the verdict is announced. And again, this seems to be a way of saying, Putin, you shouldn't be making these kind of comments and things. All right. January 2011, Putin again announces another big oil deal with British Petroleum, that's what BP stands for, and the Russian oil giant Rosneft. This, again, is Putin as prime minister making these announcements, not the president. Also in January, there's a bombing in the Moscow airport. That 37 people were killed. The bomb takes place in the luggage area, and 173 people were injured. It's a pretty horrific attack. Again, attributed to Chechens. And Medvedev, fires the head of the airport, talks about the need to improve policing and protection. But this is an ongoing concern, this lingering problem of Chechnya. And then in March, you have Medvedev again, and this time specifically repudiating a statement that Putin makes, because Medvedev has agreed that Russia would take no action in the United Nations against the NATO bombing in Libya that leads to the overthrow of Gaddafi. And Gaddafi had been an ally of Russia, a long-time ally of Russia, and which upsets Putin greatly. And he makes a comment that this NATO intervention is similar to the Crusades. How the West Europeans and Western Orient people are trying to control the people of the Middle East. And Medvedev says this is not a term that should be used. It's such a loaded term in the Middle East. And so the tension again between these two is there. And then in March, Medvedev takes a major step where he orders all government ministers to resign from the boards of state firms. And this is really unusual for people in the West because this does not typically happen in the West. But in Russia, you've got this close relationship with top government officials serving on the boards and of major companies in Russia and getting funds from those companies. Often companies in the areas in which these ministers are supposedly to be in charge. Well, by May, the deal between British Petroleum and Rosneft falls apart for reasons we don't need to go into here. Um, but then there's growing concern in May also about the position of the head of the Federation Council. And Medvedev okays the removal of this long term head of the Federation Council uh, because he's been too critical of United Russia. And yet he's also criticizing United Russia, but also saying he's loyal to Putin. And Medvedev um, uses his authority to get this fellow out of office. In June, you have a series of quotes on the sheet there. Medvedev saying that Russia needs to modernize. And this again gets back to where Medvedev was trying to stake out that he was a more modern president, that the Russian needed to be much more efficient in its operation. It needed to be much more Western oriented, without saying it precisely like that. And he was also critical of anyone holding too much power. And but then he also turns around a day or two later and asks, he said, Putin and I, we don't compete. We work together. There's not a competition. We have the same general interest. And Putin comes back in response to that and says yes, that he works well with Medvedev. There's no problems building. That they have a joint program. They work together. This speculation of a rift between in the tandem just doesn't exist. Um, so in August, they go on vacation together. The families go on vacation, and there's these photographs of the two of them walking along the Volga River, talking about issues. And this was done very clearly to let the Russian press, the Russian people, and the world know that in Putin's mind, there's not a real conflict here. All right. And following the vacation in August and September, Dmitry Medvedev announces that he will not run again for the president. And the end of September, the finance minister, Alexei Kudrin, resigns. Now, Kudrin is an important fellow. Alexei Kudrin, Kudrin. He has been helpful, almost absolutely incredibly instrumental in shoring up the Russian economy, and largely his efforts to build that rainy day fund helped Russia recover from the world financial crisis in 2008 faster than almost any other country in the world. Well, he resigns, and he is thought to be preparing himself to run for the presidency. That he could be running for the presidency. And the question is who is going to run next? Is Medvedev going to run for a second term as he's eligible to? Or what about Putin? Uh, September ends with Putin and the people around him forming a new organization called the All Russia People's Front. And this is another effort at trying to find organizational support, to create organizational support for Putin outside of United Russia, because United Russia is getting a lot of criticism for being corrupt and not representing the interest of the people, representing the interest of the administration. And so this All Russia People's Front is a non-governmental organization committed to Putin and the ideals of a strong central state that he has been pushing. So we'll move on and talk about the United Russia Party Conference. kind of like a convention for the party. And both Medvedev and Putin lay out plans and announce here the plans that Putin says have been in place since the Tanda began. That Medvedev would not run for president, which was already been announced, and that Putin would run for president. And he would run again as an independent, but he hopes to get the support of United Russia. And if he is elected, he says to the United Russia uh, United Russia members, that he will appoint as his prime minister uh, Dmitry Medvedev. All right. This generates a lot of hostility, lots of complaints by prominent Russians that this Medvedev period has been kind of a sham, and all this is concerning because of the December elections for the Duma that are being held. And so there are widespread demonstrations. And go and look at the chart that I showed you, that I sent you before, that you'll see that United Russia lost 15% of its votes down. Still the largest party, 49%, but it's lost support. The communists have gone up a little. This new party, Just Russia, that's discussed in the book, has gone up. The Liberal Democrats gone up a little bit. Everybody's gone up except United Russia because of the complaints about corruption associated with the regime. And some of the information that comes out to the press about electoral shenanigans and ballot stuffing is associated with a non-governmental organization, Russian, called GOLOS, G-O-L-O-S, which trains individuals to act as election monitors. And so it has people around the country observing the election process, and afterwards they publish a report that there was a lot of interference with the election. And this generates a lot of support, and a lot of demonstrations take place. Now, Putin, after the election, the Duma, says that the government has lost the trust of the people. I said it's time to give certain powers back to the regions. Who's taken those powers from the regions but Putin as president? Now he's talking about, because of these demonstrations, again in the major cities largely, but over the country, lots of demonstrations in November and December after the elections. And this is November prior to the Duma election. This is where Putin, and it's discussed in the Myers book, goes into a mixed martial arts wrestling event in the Olympic Stadium in Moscow, and he is booed when he walks in. And of course, later this was covered in the press and said, no, they weren't booing, they were cheering, but it was pretty clear at the time that this was booing. And so, finishing up 2011, the United Russia lost a number of seats, yet it still maintained its majority. Protesters, tens of thousands of protesters in Moscow, representing a new force of opposition. The spokesman for the year ends December, the spokesman for the Orthodox saying that the people should have more control over the electoral system. That's a pretty amazing statement for the church interfering in these elections. But remember, the Duma elections precede the presidential elections, and it's gone over 30 minutes here. I want to end this, so the next video will begin with the year 2012 and talk about the change from Medvedev back to Putin as president of Russia. All right?